Good morning, everyone. The microphone is working, yes? Again? Okay. Well, buenos dias. My thanks to Professor Eladio Febrero and to the Asociación Económica Crítica for inviting me to Cuenca and inviting me to give this address. I'm really very honored to be here. But the first thing I want to do is I want to begin by apologizing that I can't give my talk in Spanish. I have to speak in English. Pero créame, ustedes están fortunados que no estoy hablando en castellano. Now, my talk is about the false promise and bitter fruit of neoliberalism. And the bitter fruit is economic and political. The economic is the destruction of shared prosperity, and the political is the rise of proto-fascist politics. And I'm going to focus on the United States, but I think the argument I will make is applicable everywhere. I can certainly see how it can apply to Western Europe. And one of the things I would invite you to do is to think, if you were to do the same exercise for Spain, how would you be describing neoliberalism? If you were to do the same exercise for the European Union, what has been the bitter fruit of neoliberalism in Europe? So neoliberalism is a political economic philosophy, and it consists of two claims. One claim is an economic claim, and the other claim is a political claim. The economic claim is that free market, laissez-faire economies are the best way to organize economic activity as they generate efficient outcomes that maximize well-being. The political claim is that free market economic arrangements promote individual liberty. Now, the neoliberal claim that free markets promote individual liberty has been very important. That claim extended economics into the political sphere, and it added to the attraction of free market ideology. So the combination of neoliberalism's economic claim and its political claim was very compelling. And I think that's been a big reason for the appeal of neoliberalism. What I'm going to argue is that both of those promises, economic well-being and promotion of liberty, have proven false. We've now had a 40-year experiment that began around 1980, and it's now clear that neoliberalism has undercut shared prosperity, and it's unleashed political forces that are actually threatening liberty. And my talk is going to excavate those two developments. Now, a lot of attention has been paid to identifying the adverse economic impacts of neoliberalism, but much less attention has been devoted to identifying the adverse political impacts. And in my view, exposing those political impacts is going to be critical for reversing the tragedy of neoliberalism, because it has benefited from the false claim that it is good for liberty and that it is good for democracy. So I want to be clear that my purpose today is not to go deeply into the economic theory of neoliberalism and to criticize that theory. My purpose is not to go and explain how the neoliberal economy works. I've done that on many other occasions. Today, I just want to focus on the economic outcomes, and I'm going to provide an inventory and discuss the inventory of economic outcomes, and I want to focus on the political economic consequences of those outcomes. So the starting point is how to characterize the neoliberal economy. And as I say, my focus will be on the United States, but I ask you in the back of your minds to keep asking yourself, what's been going on in Spain? What's been going on in the European Union? Do the things that I'm saying have some resonance with your experience here in Spain? And figure 1 here provides a description of the US business cycle in the neoliberal era. And for simplicity, the era is dated as beginning in 1981 with Ronald Reagan's inauguration. And the era has had 4 business cycles that are structurally very similar. And the similarity of the business cycles reflects the shared economic DNA across those cycles. And broadly speaking, the business cycles can be described as financially driven boom-bust cycles. And the first 2 cycles, the Reagan cycle, 1981 to 1990, and the Clinton cycle, 1990 to 2001, were much stronger and more robust than the second 2 cycles. Now let's work through that list of characteristics. We have one is already that the cycles are longer. And they're longer on average than the business cycles of the, what should we call it, the Keynesian social democratic era that came before 1980. And the lengthening of the duration of the business cycle reflects a combination of disinflation and financialization. The disinflation process gave monetary policy a long runway to lower interest rates. And that was during the first 3 cycles. Every time I'll show monetary policy lowered interest rates along the way. And the financialization process has opened the spigot of credit to sustain the business expansions. And it's those 2 reasons that explain why we've been having longer business cycles. Now, very early on, the neoliberal business cycle actually showed a proclivity to stagnation. This is characteristic number 2. The first appearance of stagnation was the fragile recovery in the early 1990s. I know it's 30 years ago now. But it was in the early 1990s that we in the US first started talking about the term jobless recovery, a recovery without jobs, which was never the case before in the post-war business cycle. And then that was followed by a second period of jobless recovery in early 2000. In business cycle number 3, there was another period of jobless recovery. And in the 4th business cycle, that became full-blown stagnation. So really quite early on, despite all the political happy talk about neoliberalism, we could see, if you wanted to see it, there were very clear clues that it was not working as the politicians claimed it was. Now, the causes of stagnation are debated by critical economists, but for me, there are 3 things that have contributed to stagnation. The first is the neoliberal economy broke the link between productivity growth and wage growth. So that's one reason why we've had stagnation. The second reason is the neoliberal economy created income inequality. And the third reason for stagnation is that you have an accumulation of debt burdens. As households keep borrowing to keep the consumer economy alive, you have more debt burdens, and then you have to pay interest on debt burdens, and that kicks in to produce stagnation. And the proclivity to stagnation is actually seen here in the time path of the Federal Reserve's target interest rate, what's called the federal funds rate. And what we see is that each cycle peak is marked by a lower cycle high interest rate. So look down the middle column. In 1981, the peak of the business cycle, the interest rate is 19.10%. In 1989, the next business cycle peak, it's 9.89%. 2001, the next business cycle peak, it peaks at 6.51%. So each time, the cycle peak in interest rates is lower. And if you look to the left, you see that each recession, the cycle trough in interest rates is also lower. And it's that process of being able to exploit the interest rate that each time enables the recovery. Until, of course, in 2008, monetary policy hits the zero lower bound and they can't lower interest rates anymore. So this trend pattern in interest rates, this downward cycling down, reflects the ongoing emergence of stagnation and the weakening of the system of aggregate demand generation that is needed to keep the economy going. Another characteristic of the neoliberal economy is that there are increased indebtedness across all sectors of the economy. So you see in every sector of the economy, the debt ratio is rising. It increases, this is for the whole domestic non-financial sector, you see a rising debt to income ratio. The federal government, the federal debt is rising relative to GDP. The household sector debt is rising relative to GDP. Household mortgages, very important. See an increase in the level of mortgage debt relative to GDP. Consumer credit, business, corporate. Across every sector, you see rising debt ratios. And that's part of the way in which the neoliberal economy kept going, but it's also the sting in the tail. It's also how you begin to get into stagnation. But this process of rising debt ratios was enabled by financialization. And that's why financialization is so important to the neoliberal economy. It's what keeps it going. I'll make one more point here that's not shown there. We now see that neoliberalism is actually increasing the debt on central bank balance sheets. You can think of this process of expanding of balance sheets as actually the central bank going into debt. It is issuing IOUs. When the central bank issues monetary reserves, that is an IOU of the central bank. But what it's doing with that IOU is buying assets to try and keep the price of assets up. But it's all part of this configuration of rising debt ratios. So neoliberalism is now like a termite eating into the balance sheet of the central bank. A third feature of the neoliberal business cycle, a third feature of the neoliberal business cycle is a proclivity to financial crisis. And we see that in each of the four cycles, there is a financial crisis. The first business cycle saw the stock market crash of 1987, if you all remember. Incredible decline in, I think it was September 1987, or maybe it was October 1987. The second business cycle saw the crisis of 1998, the long-term capital management crisis, when the Federal Reserve had to come and rescue Wall Street. And then it also saw the bursting of the technology stock market bubble in 2001. The third business cycle saw the bursting of the house price bubble in 2007, and that triggered a sequence that led to the great financial crisis of 2008. And the fourth business cycle, the one we're in now, saw the COVID-induced stock market crash of March 2020. And though COVID was the cause of the crash, I would say that the market was vulnerable because it was already very overvalued by the process of the fourth business cycle. And the question in my mind is what comes next? If you think that the COVID crash was just a temporary interruption, well, then the cycle hasn't really finished. We had a period of interruption. We had a period of starting it again. How does this business cycle end? If history is a guide, if this analysis is right, that there's something structurally wrong with the DNA of neoliberalism, then it would suggest that we're going to have some sort of financial crisis in the next couple of 3 years. Now, a fourth feature of the neoliberal economy is that you need government to provide a floor to the economy, and you need government to provide the stimulus to revive it. So neoliberalism claims to be a philosophy of laissez-faire, yes? But the reality is it produces an unstable economy in which the busts would produce economic depression if the economy were left to itself. And that's why you have a repeated need for government intervention to save the economy and restart the economy. A fifth feature of the neoliberal economy is a redistribution of income toward capital. Now, this distribution of income is quite a complex rearrangement of income. And you can understand the rearrangement by working through the tree diagram in this figure. What we see is capital's share of income increases at the expense of labor. And within the capital share, there is a redistribution towards interest payments that is brought about by increased indebtedness. And there's also an increase in the financial sector's share of total profits. And if you go down the other side of the tree, within the wage share, the overall wage share shrinks, but within the wage share, there's a shift from workers to managerial pay. Managerial pay and CEO pay are counted as part of the wage share. Figure 3 shows the evolution of the pre-tax profit share of domestic industries. It's just domestic industry. It doesn't include multinational industry for the period 1960 to 2022. And from the 1960s to 1980, the profit share trended down. The trend is broken after 1980 when you begin an upward shift in the profit share, and the trend accelerates the longer you go into the neoliberal period. But profitability is very cyclical, so it tends to collapse when you have a bust. And what we see is that you therefore have these very large swings in profitability along a rising upward trend. Figure 4 shows the relationship between hourly compensation and productivity for the period 1948 to 2020. This is for the US economy. And what you see very clearly is productivity and hourly compensation of workers grows together until about 1980. The two lines track very closely. And then after 1980, they just diverge. Productivity keeps rising, not as fast as before, but it's still positive productivity growth. But they separate, and compensation grows far slower than productivity after 1980. And that explains why the wage share fell. There's this detachment of wages from productivity. The sixth feature of the neoliberal economy is massively increased personal income inequality, which has been documented by Thomas Piketty, and this slide is taken from Thomas Piketty's book. It shows the evolution of the top decile income share for US and selected European countries from 1900 to 2010. The US top decile share bottomed in 1970, and then it rose steadily until 2010. And you see a similar pattern is also for European countries, which shows that neoliberalism is actually a global economic arrangement, not a national economic arrangement. A sixth feature of the neoliberal economy is an accelerated decline of unions, measured in terms of union membership as a share of total employment, what we call union density. Union density peaked in the mid-1950s, and then it began a very slow decline through to 1979. After 1979, the decline in union density accelerates. What's going on? until 1980, union density held its own in those sectors of the economy where unions already existed, like manufacturing. Union employment, union membership grew with manufacturing. But the economy was moving away from the unionized sectors. And so overall density started to fall. But after 1980, the pattern changes. Even in the sectors where there were unions, employment in those sectors starts to grow faster than union employment. And that's because firms in the United States, corporations, receive a signal that we can go ahead and start creating non-union jobs. So you see that in Ford, in General Motors, all the auto industry moves to the South, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, which is non-unionized. And so you get an accelerated decline in union density. And what's interesting about this slide is it shows union density on the bottom, the red line, the blue line, no, sorry, the top, and the top line is the share of income going to the top 10%. And you see this very clear pattern as a relationship between union density and the share of income going to the top percentage. So what unions did is they lowered inequality. And how did they do that? They did it by increasing the wage share, and they also increased the share of the wage share that went to workers. And put that together, you get a much better income distribution. A seventh characteristic of neoliberal economy, which I've already talked about, is the sharp fall in manufacturing employment. And it falls both in absolute terms and as a share of total employment. That's the slide from 1939 through to 2021. Absolute manufacturing employment peaked in 1979 in the US, and it fell after that. And since then, because total employment has grown quite fast, manufacturing employment has fallen very fast as a share of overall employment. Manufacturing share of employment was 21.6% in 1979. It was 8.4% in 2022. What you see also a very changed business cycle dynamic. Before 1980, every business cycle peak, you got a higher peak in manufacturing employment. After 1980, every business cycle peak, manufacturing employment never recovers the previous peak, and it's a zigzag downward. And a big part of the decline of manufacturing in the United States is due to the impact of globalization through first the North America Free Trade Agreement that included Mexico, and after that you have permanent normal trading relations with China, that is the precursor of China being invited into the World Trade Organization, and you have a globalization of manufacturing production with very bad effects on manufacturing employment in the Now I think manufacturing employment would have struggled because of technology developments, but the process was very accelerated because of neoliberalism and because of neoliberal globalization. So in sum, that's my description of the neoliberal economy. We saw a very, very dramatic remaking of the US economy. And that remaking of the US economy has been very sweet for Wall Street. It's been very sweet for people in the top 10% of the income distribution, but it's been quite bitter for working class families and households. So what I want to now focus is on the politics. Neoliberalism has seeded a very bitter political fruit. And that bitter political fruit has received less attention because it's been slower to ripen. The economic deterioration came first. It was almost like the economic bitter fruit was needed to pollinate the political bitter fruit. And I would say that the political bitter fruit is still ripening, and that's why it's such a timely issue to turn our attention to. Now, a first thing to notice is that political developments under neoliberalism have been quite complicated. And the first important point is that neoliberalism has involved a double shift to the right. The first shift was the initial turn to neoliberalism that was initiated by Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the US. And the success of Thatcher and Reagan pulled the entire political spectrum to the right, my right, your left, and redefined politics. Thatcher and Reagan redefined politics as we know it. And that redefinition is evident in the Third Way movement, which saw center-left social democracy collapse and redefine itself according to neoliberalism. I know we have that with the Democrats in the United States. You have that with New Labour in the United Kingdom. I was talking with some people earlier about the socialists in Spain. They've sort of redefined themselves. We might call them new socialists. And today's social democrats would have been viewed as center-right in terms of their views 40 years ago. Now, the second political shift is the turn to illiberal democracy and proto-fascism that we are now experiencing. It's now that we are experiencing the second political shift in our politics. And in the US, you see that in the rise of Donald Trump-styled republicanism. In Germany, it's evident in the Alternative für Deutschland. In France, it's evident in Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National. In Italy, you have the Fratelli d'Italia. In the UK, you have a very British type of reactionary politics with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and Ben Wallace and that collection of misfits. And so this is the second political fruit of neoliberalism. Now, you have to distinguish between deep causes and facilitating causes. In the US, the advance of illiberal politics has been facilitated by the obsolescence of our political institutions. So that obsolescence in the US includes the electoral college system of electing presidents, which disregards the popular vote and gives extra weight to the relatively unpopulated, illiberal smaller states. Those smaller rural states are also overrepresented in the Senate because there are 2 senators for each state, regardless of the number of people living there. Wyoming with 600,000 people, 2 senators. California with 40 million people, 2 senators. That really has a huge distortion on our politics. Another problem is the gerrymandering of congressional boundaries, which results in overrepresentation of Republicans in Congress. And these are very serious problems. But what I want to point out is they've always been part of the US political system. So to me, they are just a facilitating problem. The big question is, why have they kicked in to become important now? So when you read the newspapers are always talking about these issues. But the newspapers are not addressing the deep causes, because these problems, these institutional problems, have always been there. So what I want to say is that the shift to neoliberalism in 1980, the first political right turn, created what involved a change of economic policy. To understand the importance of 1980, you really have to understand the economic reconfiguration that was put in place. And it's that reconfiguration that is now producing the second right turn. And the driver, those changes have had consequences which are illustrated here. And I'm going to spend the last third of my lecture, half of my lecture, working through these consequences. And the first consequence of the neoliberal economic turn is the problem of socioeconomic disembedding. Now, the construct of disembedding was introduced by Polanyi in 1944 in his seminal analysis of the cause of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. And disembedding is directly relevant to the neoliberal experiment. The Pollyannian model views the economy as being embedded in society, and it is that embedding that gives stability to economic arrangements. The embedding rests on social relations of place, reciprocity, and redistribution, which are really the primitive characteristics of all societies. Now, in Polanyi's thinking, capitalism is marked by a dialectical process that he called the double movement. And it pits marketization against a push for social protection. So marketization disembeds the economy by disrupting the fundamental social relations, and that creates social dislocation and social alienation. The push for social protection then seeks to re-embed the economy and reconstruct those relations. And Polanyi applied that framework to explain the rise of fascism in the interwar years. What you had was the Victorian laissez-faire economy disembedded on a grand scale. And the destruction of embedded social relations created uncertainty and resentment, which then opened people to the pull of other ideas that offered a solution, a salve. And I'll quote here in Polanyi's words, he said, "Those ideas can be irrationalistic philosophies, racialist aesthetics, anti-capitalistic demagogy, heterodox currency views, criticism of the party system, widespread disparagement of the regime, or whatever was the name given to the existing democratic setup." So when the Victorian economy collapsed in the interwar years, and especially with the Great Depression, fascism offered itself as a solution to both the economic breakdown and the problem of social disembedding. So in a sense, the way that I interpret fascism is it's a sort of double movement in a single step. It gives both. It solves the marketization and social relation problem in one step. And again, let me quote Polanyi. It's a little bit long here, but I want to read it because it's so insightful. Polanyi writes, "The fascist solution of the impasse reached by liberal capitalism can be described as a reform of the market economy achieved at the price of extirpation of all democratic institutions, both in the industrial and in the political realm. The economic system, which was in peril of disruption, would thus be revitalized, while people themselves were subjected to a re-education designed to denaturalize the individual and make him unable to function as the responsible unit of the body politic. This re-education, comprising the tenets of a political religion that denied the idea of the brotherhood of man in all of its forms, was achieved through an act of mass conversion enforced against recalcitrants by scientific methods of torture." So I would argue the Polanyi model has clear application to the era of neoliberalism. After World War II, social democratic Keynesianism succeeded in re-embedding capitalism. Neoliberalism worked to disembed the economy, and with the disembedding has come the return of openness to fascist ideas. The evisceration of manufacturing employment was one place where there was disembedding. Not only were jobs lost, but those jobs paid historically high wages and benefits. In the US, manufacturing had a very special place in the economy. Throughout the Midwest, many large towns were de facto single employer towns, relying on a single large manufacturing plant. When that plant closed, those towns were economically devastated. House values, which are the main asset of workers, collapsed. There were multiplier effects that were enormous throughout the local economy, and the tax base collapsed, which undermined public schools and infrastructure. The result was local mini depressions and the destruction of future economic prospects. The manufacturing plants were often unionized, and that destroyed the local union, which was an important piece of social capital that brought workers together helped provide political identity and a sense of belonging to community. The destruction was not restricted to manufacturing workers. The fallout from the negative multipliers meant the collapse of values, home values, affected the entire community. The disembedding process hit blue-collar workers first, but the ripples then reached deep into the economy to affect other workers. And that explains the kind of puzzling range of appeal of the second right turn. It's not just blue-collar workers, it's a wide range of workers that are find the new politics of the right attractive. And the collapse of manufacturing was very tied to globalization, and that has made it easy for proto-fascist political leaders to join the disembedding shock with racist, nationalist rhetoric. The claim can be that it was foreigners who caused the damage to these economies. But of course, we know the damage was done through globalization, which is a process that was very carefully designed by corporations and governments. But it creates a very nasty political opening for the right wing to blame the manufacturing and economic disembedding on foreigners when they're not really the real cause. The next pillar in figure 8, number 2, is institutional destruction, and it has very serious negative political consequences. The main institution that was destroyed was the trade union movement. And the destruction of the trade union movement in the United States has impacts through many channels. It destroys local social capital, which amplifies the disembedding process. It had a negative effect on wage growth and inequality, and it had a very negative effect on workers' political power. In the post-war era, unions were the bedrock of social democratic political parties. They provided financial resources, they provided volunteer workers, and they increased union voter participation, and union members tended to vote social democratic. And in return, the social democrats made economic policy that was favorable to unions and favorable to workers. So that configuration provided a worker-friendly political counterweight to the political influence of business and the wealthy. The destruction of unions undid that political formula, and it stripped workers of political influence and protection. And it weakened the social democratic parties, and by weakening the social democratic parties, it made those parties open to capture by neoliberal thinking. And then the weakening of the center-left parties then made it even easier for the parties of the center-right and the neoliberal parties. And so when you put those pieces together, there was a form of parallel political disembedding in which working class voters lost contact with the historic parties of the left, and the center-left parties all migrated to the right. And that meant working class voters became increasingly unanchored and open to the appeal of other voices. The third pillar is inequality and power. By increasing income inequality, neoliberalism has increased the political power of the business and the wealthy, and basically, politics now delivers what the wealthy want. And this has both economic and political consequences. At the economic level, it strengthens the feedback loop. The neoliberals put in place policies they like. The changes in the economy increase their political power, which means they can double down on the policies that they've already put in place. And so you have a deepening cycle of neoliberalism. Every time we think you have a political crisis, it's going to cause a swing back in the other direction. But it doesn't. You get a doubling down of the neoliberal policy because they own the economics, the political system in its entirety. And at the political level, this process then creates a sense that politics is rigged. And when people, voters, start to think that politics is rigged, you get a process of political alienation, and that therefore worsens the problem of political disembedding. The fourth pillar is the transformation of economic identity. And this has impacts also for political identification. There are several ways in which economic policy has transformed economic identity. Neoliberal policy has encouraged home ownership, in the United States this is, and it's also encouraged new retirement saving arrangements where people are direct investors in the stock market by what are called defined contribution pension plans. You save directly and you put your pension contribution in your own name in the stock market. And what do we see? Homeowners tend to be supportive of policies like tax-deductible interest, easier mortgage credit access, low interest rates, anything that inflate house prices. Homeowners like it. And stock market investors, they may come to identify with financial interests. So, and also you see that in the United States, economic policy has used the tax code to provide subsidies for housing, subsidies for healthcare, subsidies for education. And this process of using the tax code peels people away from supporting collective provision of these things. And they now start to identify with private provision of healthcare, private provision of education, private provision of housing. So what you have is neoliberalism can transform people's economic identities, and you get a split in workers regarding their role as workers, homeowners, and investors. And in a way that echoes Herbert Marcuse's one-dimensional man problematic. Remember in the 1960s, Marcuse talked about the problematic of consumerism, in which the working class understandings of capitalism, workers become confused because they lose their bearings and become defenders of the system that oppresses them through the process of consumerism. Well, in my view, neoliberalism has the same problematic, but it is the problematic of ownership. Workers become indebted homeowners and small-scale investors, and that may cause them to identify with the interests of property and capital, even though property and capital can never really be the main source of their income and their well-being. And that then encourages workers to vote for neoliberal parties. And the last pillar is cultural transformation. Neoliberalism has a transformative impact on culture and political thinking. And this is very important in understanding the second political term that we're now experiencing. The economic philosophy of neoliberalism now infuses society, up and down. The ideas of neoliberalism are everywhere. It claims to promote individual liberty, but the reality is it encourages egotistical disdain for individualism, for individual liberty, and it promotes a triumph of the will mentality, which I think is at the core of fascism. Triumph of the Will, it was the title of Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 film celebrating the Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg. So neoliberal political economic philosophy begins with the neoclassical construct of Homo economicus. Homo economicus is the ultimate expression of individualism. But I think Homo economicus is really a fascist personality. He is a sociopathic egotist. He will do anything except to the extent that he is constrained by his budget constraint, by the deterrence of law, and by the deterrence of reputation. Homo economicus has no conscience. It's just constrained by his budget, penalties of law, and the penalties of loss of reputation. And the fascist becomes visible when you interpret Homo economicus relationally. The sociopath seeks to get his way by exerting his will over others. And that's the view of Ayn Rand in her novel Atlas Shrugged. Rand's view is a form of fascist egotism, and it's very widely admired and celebrated in the United States. Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve Chairman, the great admirer of Ayn Rand. And students across the US, it's amazing, they read Atlas Shrugged and they are captivated by it. And in cinematic culture, it's expressed in the movie, I don't know if you remember the movie Wall Street with Gordon Gekko, and his creed of greed is good. This is all the expression of Homo economicus' sociopathic egotism, the desire to dominate others. And I think mainstream economics is very, very deeply implicated in this cultural transformation. Mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, is one of the inspirations, the foundation of neoliberal economic thinking. And there's a lot of experimental evidence that shows exposure to neoclassical economics is behaviorally transformative. They've surveyed students before the economics class and at the end of the semester after the economics class. And what the surveys find is that it diminishes honesty. Exposure to neoclassical economics will diminish honesty of students. It will diminish cooperative behavior. It encourages free riding, and it weakens the charitable impulse. So the economics profession has very high social standing, and it's reflected in all that talk of economics being the queen of the social sciences. It takes Homo economicus as the fundamental characterization of people, and it endorses that characterization. It then, those ideas are then infused in the undergraduate education curriculum, in business schools, and they then ripple throughout society. They influence policy, and they influence the way society thinks. And so even though, ask a mainstream economist, they'll say they're against the turn to proto-fascism, but the ideas that they have been teaching, they've been pushing into society ideas that encourage a proto-fascist way of thinking. So let me then finish with the last point, the conclusion here, and what I think is perhaps the bitterest fruit of all. The bitterest fruit of all of neoliberalism is the capture of the political parties of the center-left by the right wing. And this capture is reflected in is because of the intellectual hegemony of neoliberalism, and it's represented in the third way movement that is associated with Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Gerhard Schröder. What does the third way do? In my view, it advocates a form of compassionate neoliberalism. It's neoliberal, but it wants to soften things just a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. And neoliberalism's capture of the third way, neoliberalism's capture of the center-left by the third way has had three bitter impacts. First, it means that center-left parties have helped construct and legitimize the neoliberal economy that has done so much damage. Social democrats have become junior partners of the center-right. In the United States, no neoliberal reform has passed without some support from the Democratic Party. And I'm not talking about a little bit of support. You require about 1/3 of the Democratic Party to push the neoliberal reforms in the United States. It's actually the Democratic Party that holds the veto on everything, but because it's been captured by the third way, social democrats have actually helped construct the neoliberal economy. The second consequence of the capture is the third way has produced political confusion and alienation. The third way political dialogue has further impoverished the political capability for engaging issues of class and class conflict. So you can never use the term class conflict in the US. You can't talk about working class people. That type of language has been banished from our political conversation, and it's been banished by the third way politics of the old center-left. And because the third way does not offer a pro-worker political program, many US working class voters have said, well, if it's a choice between this form of neoliberalism or that form of neoliberalism, a choice between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, in that case, I'm going to vote my values, and my values are guns, Bible, and flag. And so the Republicans make that appeal, and they vote their values because the economic programs are roughly the same. And the third and most bitter fruit of the capture of the center-left parties is that neoliberalism now dominates both sides of the political aisle. And that means the third way obstructs an alternative to neoliberalism. Third way, liberal elites occupy the place of opposition that should be held by true critics of neoliberalism, and that obstructs the politics that are needed to reverse the drift to proto-fascism. And strangely, in my view, that makes liberal elites a political danger, because they are obstructing the politics that we need now to fight this wave of proto-fascist political development. Now, so what can be done? Well, proto-fascists are going to do what fascists do. I don't believe they can be changed. I don't think politics is about changing, trying to persuade fascists not to be fascists. It's not going to work. What can be changed is the quality of opposition to neoliberalism. And that requires breaking with the compromised politics of liberal Democrats in the US and the compromised politics of New Labour in the United Kingdom. And I'll risk saying it after what I've said, perhaps the compromised politics of the Socialist Party in Spain. And part of breaking with that is breaking with neoclassical economics, because neoclassical economics is the intellectual mainspring of neoliberalism. Breaking with neoclassical economics is not just an abstract intellectual academic exercise. It's of vital importance because ideas affect how we think, they affect what we can imagine, and they affect the choices we make. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, Tom, for your interesting speech. Creo que tenemos como media hora, más o menos, para debate o para formular preguntas. Así es que si vais pidiendo la palabra. Bueno, dice Oscar que presente...
No es traducir. Puedo dar una respuesta que quiero.
Bueno, Tom amablemente me envió un mensaje con una versión breve de su currículum que he olvidado abrir. Entonces, espero que muchos de vosotros conozcáis a Tom Palley. Es digamos, uno de los autores post-keynesianos, quizá americanos, más conocidos. Actualmente es editor de Review of Keynesian Economics. Y, bueno, no sé mucho más que añadir ahora mismo, brevemente. Así es que, bueno, paso a ceder la palabra a los interesados. La pregunta en castellano, los espacios, y si no, pues yo traduzco.
No, yo lo hago en inglés.
Perfecto.
De esa máquina funciona en inglés, no en castellano.
Yo no, solamente traduzco del inglés al castellano.
No funciona bien.
Cuando hablas en castellano no reconoce el idioma.
Okay, I have no question. I just wanted to share feelings. So, from my perspective, there is no, we can say, a debate between socialism liberalist or neoliberalist or whatever. So the problem is how we define capitalism. So capitalism is everywhere. It's in China, it's in Russia, the oligarchs, that's the poor capitalism, even we can say fascist. And if we consider that view, and if you consider, for example, in the case of the United States, that is the one that you know better, is the Republican Democratic Party was divided in two pieces, and since then they control the politics. Like in Spain, Franco divided PP and PSOE, and then we have socialists and right. But it's the same model. It's the same people governing. In the case of Spain, I don't know. I think it's much better the United States model because there is the technology, the military. Even if you have, as you know, this famous the military complex. So they control the country. Here is till now, we thought it was the banking sector, but the real sector is the energy, and now they are in power. We can see because they control the government. And our politics is like yours, more or less, or homosexual, yes or not, or abort, or abortion, yes or no, and this is the debate. But this is not economics. And if you go to the books, whatever, it was a famous, United States citizen that said, let me write the books of economics because I can control the country, I can control the economy. And this is the problem. There is no a book of economics because it's mathematics. The neoclassical model is not applicable. You say, oh, this is abstract. It's not abstract. It's just models. We study models, logic, philosophy, as Adam Smith, he was a professor of philosophy. But we are not debating about what happens in the real economy. And this is the real problem. I'm very happy that you were showing us what was the reality, even if you didn't connect it with politics at the end, because you say, the wages are increasing or the productivity is increasing. So this is the reality, but this is connected with politics. At the end, Obama, which is, Nobel Prize of Peace, and he has made more work than any other president in the history of the United States. So that means, it's like a fake. The politics is fake, and we have to consider what is happening in the real economy, and we cannot change the fascist or the socialist, We want, in Spain, socialists who are socialists, because we don't have that. Till now, I don't know. Now it's a different debate, but it's like so. My approach is it could be better to connect instead of with politics with economics. So trying to include real applied or real thinking that can change, that can help economics. And now, according to your data, I was surprised. Because it's breaking even the models that we study in the books. For example, the interest rate normally goes a pair with inflation. The inflation rate, and this is not anymore because the interest rate is down and the inflation is up. So it's like, that famous problem that we have at the beginning with the Philip curve, that it doesn't work anymore. Okay, and if the interest rate go down, it's not more investment. Because the Keynesian model is not working as it used to be. And the monetary model is more problematic, even here in Spain, that we don't control any part of the money. We have like a representative in the European Bank that can, try to construct policies according to our needs. That's we call now for the gas model the Iberian model, or I don't know how to say la diferencia ibérica esto del gas. No sé cómo decirlo en inglés. Okay. The exception. That could be the Iberian exception. Okay, that should be in our case for the economics in the European model. That I understand that it's difficult for you, from the United States to see what's happening here because even in the news we don't appear. I mean, it's Europe. But at the end, Europe is disappearing because the United States is focusing about supposedly a war with China, which is a real war with technology. And this is going to change the future. And this is, I'm interested in the debate because I have seen there are many participations in that perspective. And I don't know, you can say whatever because there is no like a question. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I do. There's a lot there, and I provoked some thoughts in me. And the point you ended with the last of all, that Europe is disappearing. I write about this a little bit, and people don't like what I write when I say that yes, Europe needs to be Europe, or else it will. Right now, Europe is caught up in a web of wars that, in my view, are very substantially created by the United States. And Europe is paying the cost for not having its own geopolitical identity. And it will pay it, the cost will only get higher. And my fear, by the way, that the cost will be to make the proto-fascist trend stronger in Europe. But you made many different points. Part of my talk is very much about trying to connect economics and politics. I'm quite critical of the post-Keynesians and the left for studying economics in a vacuum, in a way. We say we do political economy, but you read our textbooks and so on, books on the super multiplier, the Kalecki has a little bit of politics. Kalecki is about the only macroeconomist who puts politics right at the center. But Paul Davidson, the American post-Keynesians, Schrafer, it's very invisible, the politics. And I think we need, part of what I want to do is make very clear how economics has a foundational impact on politics, political understanding. It has an impact on who we are, on our personalities, on our psychology, and that must then affect the economy and the political system. So this is sort of the beginning of a research program that I'm going to try and do. I'm a macroeconomist by training. I'm giving up writing on macroeconomics. There are lots of articles I would like to write in macroeconomics, but I don't think macroeconomics is going to persuade anyone. For 30 years, we've been doing Keynesian, Kaleckian macroeconomics. It's been a much better model. It's helped us see things that are going to happen, and they have happened, and yet we get ignored, or even worse, little pieces of what we say get captured and included in the neoclassical model. And so they piece it together. Suddenly when we have a problem with interest rates, you talk about the interest rates as being a parallel to the collapse of the Phillips curve. No, it's not true. Because now you have Larry Summers saying that the real interest rate, the equilibrium real interest rate, the natural interest rate is negative. And then the idea survives. So the zero lower bound prevents monetary policy from having the negative interest rate, and then that explains the problem. So they can always make some little adjustment, some theoretical adjustment. And that leads me to my next point, which is we have to go to win this thing, and this is why I'm not going to be doing writing macroeconomics very much in the future. We have to go deep into the critique of the neoclassical model and expose it, how totally flawed it is. What I didn't say, I have more in the paper. At the end, all of the things that I talked about, all those things, I think they're important. I think they're persuasive, but you cannot fit any of this in a neoclassical conversation because Homo economicus is exogenous. Homo economicus does not have a mind, does not have a brain, does not have an identity. So all of these things cannot be fit into that conversation. And yet anyone knows that these things are real. And we have to go down this route to show that they have a wrong description of Homo economicus, which means they have a wrong description of the economy, which means their prescriptions cannot be trusted. And that leads you to policy. Now, we do need to, so the next point is, I am not so much in terms of posing the political problem. I don't think it is a debate between socialism versus capitalism. which was the way the political debate was framed 60 years ago. What I'm more interested in now is what I call the conversation around varieties of capitalism. There are many varieties of capitalism and so, in fact, socialism never went away. We have massive public sectors. That's a form of socialism. Capitalism needs that massive public sector to keep going. So it's an artificial dichotomy. What we're going to talk about, and I would hope in the future, is varieties of capitalism. If we're going to talk about varieties of capitalism, that's when we need theory. How does capitalism work? What is the fundamental economics on which these varieties of capitalism rest? What pieces get carried to one variety? What pieces carried to another variety? How do the different varieties work? And that would sort of be my economic research program for the coming years. And the last point you raised about class versus identity. For me, they're both very critical, but class is fundamental. You talked about the gender issues, the race issues, the nationalism issues, religious identity. Every person who has an identity, they all also belong to a class. So what we need to do is put class and identity together, but a politics that is pushed through identity will never work. It's a politics actually that lends itself to division rather than solidarity. Because once your identity issue is satisfied, you will peel away. And we see this at the sort of, if you try and create solidarity basically on providing rights, once your itch has been scratched, as it were, then you no longer have a solidarity with others. But if you see yourself as class, in terms of class, I'm a working class person, then even if they give me everything on identity, racial identity, gender identity, religious identity, whatever, I will still remain working class after that, and I will have a solidarity that is class-based that can become the foundation for building, or choosing an alternative variety of capitalism. So we must put class in there, but to do it, we're going to have to do it through the type of ways that I've talked about. Like Homo economicus does not have a class. We must be able to infuse class in there because class is fundamental to the way we think. And this has been my critique for the post-Keynesians and the left. They have an exogenous notion of class. It has to be infused in us psychologically and intellectually in terms of our personality, our character, our education, our understanding, our belief system, as it were.
First, a very brilliant talk, and I think the talk summarizes who are you. In my opinion, it is a representative of the holistic approach to link economics, politics, social, cultural things. I think it is part of the identity and contribution. My question is very concrete. In the vision of the first part, economic issues, you have mentioned, but I think it is very important, is the shocking element in the last years, the interest rate. It has been zero and even negative. So I wonder, who is behind that? I don't think it is capitalism in general. I don't think it is financial capitalism. So who is behind? And I understand that financial capitalism banks have reacted multiplying the number of loans. But who is behind?
Well, that would be a sort of a sociological inquiry into the politics of quantitative easing. And I think there's multiple forces going on. I mean, the neoliberals are pragmatic as well as being ideological. When the economy gets into problems, they will do what it takes to save the economy from collapsing. And there was ernoughh of a Keynesian inheritance left over so that in the United States, Ben Bernanke and then Janet Yellen pushed basically very Keynesian policies. That was the way about pushing the interest rate down. And then they went a step further, Ben Bernanke, with quantitative easing, which was, I would say, it was sort of a kind of plutocratic Keynesianism. They used the power of the central bank not to bail out households and purchase mortgages and help get debt levels down. They used them to push up asset prices and to put a floor under financial markets. They used it to restore confidence that credit instruments would not default. So, and Wall Street liked that. Wall Street was very, very supportive of it. In that moment in time, but all of Wall Street was supportive of this sort of plutocratic Keynesianism. Problem for Wall Street is that negative interest rates for too long doesn't work. It doesn't work for the banks and the owners of bonds if they are depreciating. So that's why you're having this, and we don't know what the solution will be. In these economies, a lot of it is feeling your way, intuiting your way, and that's what they're doing now with the tight money policy. They're trying to put inflation back in the bottle so that at least if you have a zero real interest rate, at least money maintains its value and is not eroded by inflation. But if that doesn't work, then they'll try and find something else. But I do disagree with you. I do think financial interests are very behind everything that happens. The Federal Reserve System, all the people in it are financially identified. Jerome Powell is a former banker. Alan Greenspan was very, very connected. There is a sociological network that connects monetary policy very, very closely with Wall Street. The New York Fed is very tied into the activities of Wall Street. They solicit advice from the Wall Street economists. They solicit the chief economist of Goldman Sachs. They solicit it from the Goldman Sachs partners. They solicit it from Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase. So I would disagree with your point when you said that financial interests were not there. They were there, but they're pragmatic. They have a lens. That lens leads them to look in certain directions, and then within that direction, they explore what works best for them. And so they could become Keynesian. There's nothing in Keynes that says Keynesianism is social democratic. Just like you can have varieties of capitalism, you have varieties of Keynesianism. You can have social democratic Keynesianism. You can have military industrial Keynesianism. You can have plutocratic Keynesianism that focuses on lowering tax rates. They will use Keynesianism to save the economy. But it doesn't mean they'll push the economy in a social democratic direction.
Yeah, very inspiring presentation. I'm going to try to be very brief, but I completely agree with the presentation. As you have mentioned, these neoliberal policies and also globalization have transformed institutions. They're related, for example, the welfare state, the progressive nature of the fiscal system, also unions. That slide that was really clear. So my question is, after being aware of this capacity of capitalism of affecting the traditional institutions, these compensatory institutions, all this cultural transformation that we could call this superstructure, should we trust, should we believe in these same institutions are going to be the solution as they were 80 years ago? Should we imagine other type of institutions? Or maybe the left should be more active and more anti-capitalist in their narrative after being aware that these solutions or these institutional solutions are being affected
by this new stage of capitalism that is stronger and that is changing also the potential solution. So my question is this one. The traditional solution can be the current solution, or should we be more imaginative?
Well, I'm all for imagination, so I never try and to a degree, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but make sure the gardening is rigorous. And that there is a logic there, that it's not an aspiration that is not rooted in theory, and theory that is rooted in a good understanding of society and individual behavior. So let 1,000 flowers bloom. As for what has been happening, yes, there has been more institutional change than I talked about there, but sometimes we overstate, by the way, the degree of institutional change. The welfare state has been repressed, but it's still very, very significant. I did mention a little bit when I talked about economic identification, the way that it's been changed. You used to, in the United States, get what was called a defined benefit pension. Your employer made a contribution for you, and when you retired, you got a fixed sweldo for the rest of your life. That has been done away with. That type of pension doesn't exist. Instead, what the state does is it gives you a tax subsidy, a tax credit. If you save a little bit of your income and you put it in an investment account, it's tax privilege. And it will also, the state will also give the corporation a tax credit if it gives a matching donation. You make a contribution, the company makes a contribution for you, they both go into your account. And so it's still a welfare state, but it's a change in the character of the welfare state. And I've written about that, how important that is. But in terms of total money spent, in terms of, you look at the budget, government budgets, the cost of the welfare state is roughly the same as it was 30 or 40 years ago. But the way in which that money is spent is changed. It's much more in the form of what economists call tax expenditures, and much less in the form of direct spending by the state. I would say no. We had solutions that worked very well. The neoliberals wanted to undo those solutions because that's what the whole privatization of the welfare state movement about. You can't make as much money when government is doing the activity itself. And therefore, they have to privatize it. Privatize the pension arrangements, get rid of public housing, make it all private housing. And it's been, well, we lost the political fight. And therefore, we must win the political fight. And that comes back to these arguments. I don't think you're going to win the political fight by purely presenting economic models. You're going to have to show economic models that are embedded in politics and politics that's embedded in economic models. And this is the way to persuade people to say, well, look, this is the way that you've been. And that's why I think challenging the notion that neoliberalism advances liberty is important. In the United States, that's been a very, very powerful thing. Milton Friedman, you know, Free to Choose, his famous book, very captivating on the public imagination. We need to have a response to that you're not actually free to choose. We're actually been going backwards in terms of our liberties. And of course, some of the Marx said, the destitute person is not really free. But more than that, we need to say that it actually produces a type of proto-fascist politics by encouraging a mentality where you don't have, or at least the type of solidarity you have is an oppressive solidarity. You want to triumph over others rather than have a sort of a cooperative society built on reciprocity and arrangements like that. So I'm not as pessimistic as you. I think some of the things that worked in the past are very workable today and quite easily restored. But some things are not. Globalization for me is a huge, huge problem. It's undone the possibilities Keynes wrote about of national economic sovereignty. And for me, one needs to have some sort of, therefore, regional economic arrangements. That's why I'm a very, very big supporter of the European Union. And as a British citizen, appalled and shamed by Britain's decision to leave, which I think has only made social democratic politics in Britain more difficult. And that's why the neoliberals were all for it. The idea was to make it more difficult for Britain to be a social democracy. And that's why I don't like what the Labour government's about. It was Keir Starmer, not Labour government's a mistake, not the opposition. Keir Starmer is a third-way politician. Keir Starmer, when Boris Johnson says, I'm going to jump 1 meter off the cliff, Keir Starmer says, okay, I'm going to jump half a meter off the cliff. What kind of politics is that? This is a craziness. And that's where we need to fuse our working. Some pieces of the past will carry over. Some pieces will need to be completely new. And that's the place for imagination. And then there's the imagination of which pieces and how do they join together. But above all, it will have to be rooted in a sound economic theory, which I don't think we have. I'm not satisfied at all with critical economic theory. It's incomplete. And it's, in fact, I would say that the neoclassicals are ahead of us. They have more in their theory, even though it's wrong. It's actually a more comprehensive theory. And that's where I would like our research to match them mano a mano on all the items, and then we will have a more comprehensive and more persuasive theory.
I really enjoyed your talk. It was quite interesting in many aspects. I just entirely agree about the colonization of politics that neoliberalism carried out, particularly in reference to third ways everywhere. But I'd like you to comment on what cannot be defined as a third wave, i.e. real socialist experiments, because I think that is a trickier aspect for us to engage with, because I think nationalism crept into those movements and experiments as well. And for Britain, of course, I'm referring to Jeremy Corbyn's, massive loss. And I think that had a lot to do with his position on Brexit, which wasn't very different at all from what the Brexiteers, in fact, were suggesting. So I'd like you to comment on that, on the extent to which, when we try to reimagine which movement or party should inhabit that space that now is colonized, what are the issues that we've seen in the last years? Not just to say, okay, this was all neoliberalism's fault, but what was it that was a failure of instead these projects? And that was a question. And then a comment on the debate you just had on class versus social identity. And I think if we continue pushing for a return to class first politics, we actually lose a lot in terms of what is it that we can learn from the last 10 years in terms of which movements have been successful. Black Lives Matter that mobilized half of the world. The feminist strike starting from Argentina that just spread a massive way across. The main subject of the working class politics is not a white male, Western male. So if we want to counter on economic arguments, we don't have to fall into that trap. The main subject of working class politics is non-white, is engaging in formal work, and is a female. Thank you.
Okay, let me start again. You're absolutely right. The main non-white, female, but also working class. So I'm not at all for having class suppress these other pieces, make it exclusively a politics of class. It's a politics of humanistic class universalism, so that everyone has a place there. I think that if you talk about identity politics without this economic foundation, it's not enough to win the day. You'll win some battles, you'll have movements that cycle up, have their high points, and then fade away. And so it's about joining these features in a unified politics. So I hope we're on the same page in that. It's not about going back to the white male working class. That won't work at all. The demography of our countries is changing, and the injustices that go with identity oppression are too powerful, too anguishing, too alienating. But the third way has encouraged an excessive focus on identity, and lost its class anchor that needs to be brought back into the picture. And you do that by developing an economics that has identity in it, and which we don't really have. We have a sort of, the macroeconomists I work with have an exogenous class imposed. Some of them will then try and impose an exogenous identity addition or something like that. But there's got to be something more synthetic that is not there right now. Your starting point was about what's been going on. Well, I tried to get both points of this under nationalism. Yes, my favorite leftist author writing about nationalism was George Orwell. George Orwell was always very, very respectful of the ordinary person and their attachment to the flag and country, and did not want to diminish it at all. It was part of them, and they were proud of it, and God bless them for it, and we should be proud of it too, but we should own it. The flag and nationalism should be in support of a purpose of social justice and a better country, not to justify militarism, not to justify foreign aggression, not to justify putting down others, but as a sort of a sense of pride. That was the difference perhaps between patriotism and nationalism. I want a patriotic class-based analysis versus a nationalist analysis, which is aggressive and hostile. So and he's so easy to read. I don't know how he translates into Spanish, but I love George Orwell's essays where he writes about these issues. And he was very disparaging of the leftist tradition in British politics, which never had any, didn't gain traction, and itself was rather disrespectful and talked down to working class people. I think that's a huge fault. If politicians who do that have no future.
I remember, I just want to add, there's a book, because I realized about, from the questions that you received, and a different approach between us and you. Okay, you never talk about capitalism, never. But people here still work with capitalism, with classes, with these all debates, because in the globalized and the network economy, all this has disappeared. And you realize that, so you try to avoid this magic word. There is a book which is from Samuel Bowles, 2007, that he talks about, the title I think is, not sure, Capitalism. And he talks about the Chinese communist, it's not communist for him, of course, capitalist, the Russian, which is not, anymore communist, but it's still there somewhere, which is the capitalist, the caste capitalist, the familiar capitalist is the Chinese one. So characterize all the countries in the world from that perspective. Because capitalism is necessary. If you don't have capital, you cannot improve the economy. But the problem, as someone said, is the speculation, the financial capitalism. We try to add something because there is no real stock capitalism. This is the problem. And now we have the chance because there is the ecological problem, the environment problem. So we have a different capital and perhaps the social capital. So in this debate, I think this is important, that we have to change the concepts, and we need some, I'm not sure if neoliberalism is the right one, because, it's always going back to the same. But this is a suggestion to, most, I guess.
I reject your you're charged that I don't talk about capitalism. I talk about varieties of capitalism. And in fact, you talk about varieties of capitalism. You then proceeded to give a list of varieties of capitalism. So we're on the same page. And by the way, 2 issues ago, in the review of Keynesian economics, we had a symposium on varieties of capitalism in which we had 7 papers. In fact, David Soskis was one of the contributors, and he came up with, he has a neoliberal variety of capitalism in his mind, but he contributed. Vaccaro and Potenson, they have the sort of the growth models view of capitalism. Mark Blythe has a paper. There's a paper on Latin American varieties of capitalism. So I'm very aware of it. And of course, guess what? When you talk about capitalism, then you need also, and I have a paper there that talks about this too, that you need an economic theory of capitalism. And so, yes, that's absolutely a place for that. But the agents and institutions that are in that economic theory, what are they? And that's what I'm trying to get in. When I read the economics, and I think Keynesianism is a theory of capitalism. It's, in my view, an incomplete and insufficient one. I like Sam Bowles' work a lot. I use it a lot. His focus on, it's not just efficiency, it's also distribution. It's absolutely key, it's central, and that, of course, connects Bowles. That's why I think Bowles has some very Kaleckian dimensions to his thinking. But you are going to need an economic theory, and for me, the economic theory will need to be infused with psychology and sociology, which left economic theory has not been. Of course, in left sociology, we have our little siloed world of the academy, and we maybe occasionally cross-reference each other, but actually, there's very little that is truly infused with each other. And that's where I'd like to, that's where I want to, as I talk about what my research program for the coming years will be, it's going to be very much more in that direction, trying to infuse sociology and psychology into economics, where that will then be placed in the type of Keynesian, Kaleckian type of thinking that is my understanding of capitalism. And also, of course, Bowles, I think, has done, Sam Bowles, Herb Pintus and Sam Bowles, did a tremendous amount in filling out the mechanisms of expropriation that underlie the Kaleckian macro model. So they are microeconomists in that sense, and I like their microeconomics, and I work with it. By the way, it's actually neoclassical, because they're marginalists. They're sometimes referred to as neo-Marxists. They're not neoclassical in the sense of Arrow and de Bruy, the production of Pareto optimal equilibria, but they are neoclassical in the sense of willingness to use marginalist analysis, willingness to use agent-based thinking, where agents have goals, but then you have to have those agents being filled in sociologically and psychologically.
Muchas gracias al profesor Palley por su charla y muchas gracias a la audiencia y particularmente a las personas que participan en el debate posterior. Tenemos un pequeño debate, un pequeño descanso y a las 12 continuamos con las sesiones paralelas en el piso de arriba.